My name is Josh Keene. I am the wildfire mitigation specialist with WIRE, or the Wildfire Research Center. Hopefully I'm in frame now. Excellent. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'm based in the San Luis Valley in a little town called Del Norte, but I'm really excited to be here. The first wildfire I ever fought was the Big Red Fire, not too far from here. My first summer in Colorado was spent in Steamboat. So yeah, really, really fun for me to get to come back up here to a part of the state that I hold very dear to my heart, and yeah, provide these results from our project with you. I will say I am just one team member with WIRE. Yeah, I'm the mitigation specialist, but there is a brain trust of more than a handful of really smart and capable folks who make these projects happen and allow us to do this work with communities. And I just happened to be the one who was available to come up to Routt County this week to be with you all. So anyway, without further ado, I will dive in, and I'll start pretty high level for those of you who may not have gotten the survey or may not be super familiar. And I'll just talk a bit about kind of like how we implement projects before we dive into like the details of the results. And so generally, right? So we are also a 501c3 nonprofit, and our goal is just to help our partners, in this case, the Routt County Wildfire Mitigation Council, better understand like the nuanced details to the wildfire risk to the communities that they serve, and then hopefully in instances like these have opportunities to come share those results out back to the communities with the ultimate goal in mind of just helping foster wildfire adapted communities, right? Like that is the end goal that we're striving for in all of the projects that we do. We work throughout the West, and the way that we implement our projects is pretty standardized. And at a really high level, there's 4 steps. And so the first step of our approach is just sending a letter to every resident within our defined study area. So in this case, the 2 neighborhoods up here in North Routt County, just sort of notifying residents, hey, we're going to be doing this thing. You're probably going to see a fire truck driving really slowly by your house, taking a look at things. You'll probably get a survey in the mail. Please respond to that. It just helps us kind of get buy-in from the communities to the projects that we do. And then the next step in our approach begins the data collection. And so that is these rapid wildfire risk assessments that are conducted on every residential parcel within our defined study area. Really quick kind of look, right? They're called rapid assessments for a reason. Like 1 to 3 minutes on each parcel, just getting a quick look from the road. What's the house made out of? What's the vegetation around the house look like? For any of you who are familiar with like wildland fire response, it's like really similar to structure triage that happens like when a wildfire's on the landscape threatening communities. And then the next piece of our data collection are the household surveys. I imagine many of you in this room probably got it. They're pretty comprehensive. They take a little while to complete. But what they do is allow us and our partners to gain a really rich understanding about the people in the community and their, attitudes toward or experience with wildfire, which is a really great starting point for trying to get programs going to mitigate its impacts, right? And then our final approach is kind of what we're doing here today, or our final step in our approach is what we're doing here today, and that is sharing back to the community, kind of summarizing results, so that we can, our local partners can edit their programs or, better serve the people that are their constituents. And then hopefully that is an iterative process, and we keep doing this work continuously to, keep striving toward becoming more adapted to the presence of wildfire. And so I will talk pretty high level. I'll start with some results from the survey, and then we'll dive into some results from the risk assessment too. Again, this is probably redundant for a lot of people, but this is like a highlight of some of the stuff that we ask in our survey. Right, so we ask folks about their experience with wildfire. We ask respondents to rate their own property following the same attributes that the trained assessors or the professionals would have been looking at when they came by to conduct the rapid risk assessments. That way we have like a one-to-one comparison, right? This is what like a trained professional has evaluated the risk on this parcel to be, and this is what the homeowner on that parcel thinks that their risk is. And oftentimes that in and of itself is a great starting point to try and get some work done. Anyway, I don't need to talk about all of these sections, but it's a really comprehensive survey. What we did up here in North Routt, between these two communities, we conducted 263 parcel level rapid wildfire risk assessments, got 101 surveys back for a 40% response rate, which is pretty spectacular compared to most social science that is done in the world, right? Like average response rates for randomly sent surveys are like below 10%. So 40% response rate is, well, it's right on par with what our average is for most of our projects, but yeah, it's high quality data that we get to play with, which is what we really love to do. Oh, one thing I should touch on here is that every time we do a project, we do compare the risk ratings from those rapid risk assessments that the professionals conduct from the folks who respond to the survey to the folks who didn't respond to the survey, just to see if there's any difference, right? Like one could make an assumption, oh, only the folks who are at really high risk are the ones returning the surveys, that sort of thing. And what we found was that there's actually no difference in the risk on the parcel between the folks who returned the surveys and who didn't. Oftentimes that's a question that comes up, so we will dive in. So I'll cover a few demographic kind of bits from the survey, just to kind of set the stage for some background context that I think helps with the remainder of the content. So this is kind of like who returned our surveys. Yeah, I don't know that there's anything really telling to speak about here on this slide, but this is who we heard from. Folks who were average age 63, mostly males, which is actually kind of unique. Usually with our projects, it's like pretty 50-50 male and female who's responding. For whatever reason, up here in North Routt, we're mostly hearing from males. And then, yeah, we have some education, employment, and income information that we gather too. But probably more interesting is, at least from our perspective, when we're thinking about wildfire risk, is kind of like the characteristics of the homeowners and their home. And so what we found were that a third of the respondents report their home up here in North Routt being their second home, but only a really small portion rent that second home out, either short or long term. We also learned that the average age of the homes, at least as reported by the respondents up here, is about 33 years old. When I read that data point, what it tells me is that most of the kind of standard asphalt shingle roofs are probably nearing their lifespan. Just something to think about. These are the kind of like tidbits that we pick out from these random points of data. And on average, folks, at least amongst our respondent pool, have lived up here in their North Routt home for roughly 16 years. And then a bit about the kind of seasonality. So 71% of our respondents are at their home up here in North Routt full time, which means they indicated that they spend time here all 12 months of the year. And then there is some seasonality. It's not super significant, but you can see there in these months between May and October, there is some seasonality when the second homeowners are spending their time up here in North Routt. Again, just kind of things that we like to pick out, because if you're Josh running a mitigation council, you know it's fairly obvious, but you're going to have most of your humans here to engage with in the summer months, right? Just real basic, high-level stuff. And now we start getting into some interesting points. So we ask a bunch of questions about experience with wildfire. Obviously, like individual experience with wildfire is going to shape how one chooses to treat their property or prepare for evacuation and things of that nature. And what we found was that amongst our respondents up here in North Routt, there's very little direct experience with wildfire. So 1 or 2% have been evacuated from their North Routt homes, have had smoke damage, or have lost a home. So that's, I can't do this math off the top of my head, but maybe 1 or 2 respondents or something like that. And then we also ask folks about the closest distance that wildfire has come to their home. 2/3 of the respondents reported that the closest wildfire was between 2 and 10 miles away. A quarter of the respondents reported the closest wildfire being 10 miles away. And then, a couple of respondents in those closer categories. So again, not a ton of direct experience with wildfire, like on parcels or forcing evacuations or anything amongst our respondent pool up here in North Routt, which is interesting, but probably fairly accurate based on what I looked at in terms of like historical fire maps and things of that nature. So we also ask a few questions to get at folks' perceptions of wildfire risk and then subsequent response. And these are really, this is helpful information, right? Because planners really sort of need to meet communities where they're at, as it relates to like delivering education or programs or things of that nature. And so the first of these kind of risk perception questions that we ask is really straightforward, right? The statement is, my property is at risk to wildfire. And then the response options are there at the bottom, and they range from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And what we found were that 50% of our respondents agree or strongly agree that their property is at risk to wildfire. A third neither agree or disagree. We kind of interpret this as like, I'm not sure. And 17% disagree or strongly disagree with that sentiment. So just like an interesting kind of like high level thing about, okay, well, at a really base level, this is what we're dealing with these folks up here in North Routt, right? But we dig in a little bit deeper, and we ask folks about some of the factors that they think contribute to the chances of wildfire damaging their homes within the next 12 months. And again, the response options they're now up at the top, but they range from a lot to not at all. And on the graph, these are the a lots, these are not at alls, these are somewhats in the light green. And I find these responses interesting for a couple of reasons. I'll point out 2. First, the majority of the responses for all of these, right? Physical, wildfire is the physical characteristics of my home contribute to these chances, vegetation on my property, vegetation on my neighbor's property, or vegetation on nearby public lands, right? For all of these responses, the majority of folks are saying somewhat. And I think this makes a lot of sense, right? Like, wildfires are all really different. And there's a variety of conditions that sort of influence wildfire's behavior, spread, potential structure ignition. And so I think it makes sense that, the majority of folks are saying, yeah, I think, somewhat. And I think that's probably a fairly accurate response. But the second piece of information that I find really intriguing here that reveals itself to me are if we just focus on these a lot responses down there at the bottom. So fewer respondents think that the physical characteristics of their home or the vegetation around their property have the same contribution to the chances of wildfire damaging their property as the vegetation on their neighbor's property or the vegetation on nearby public lands. That's really intriguing because what we know from wildfire science, from after action reports on significant events, is that when it comes to structural ignition, the physical characteristics of the home and the vegetation directly surrounding that home play the largest role. And so there's a little bit of like sort of cognitive dissonance going on, right? Which is human nature. And that's totally fair. But from like a mitigation specialist perspective, I would love to see this trend sort of flipped on its head, right? And that's what we're trying to achieve. Anyway, I digress. I'll move on. So again, kind of continuing on with these like sentiments related to risk perception and response and things like that. So one of the questions that we ask is, if there's a wildfire on their property, how likely are the following outcomes? And I won't read them all to you, but hopefully the text on the bottom is big enough. Um, the dark blue portions of the graph represent very or extremely likely responses, and the light blue represent moderately likely responses. Um, and so what we see here are that nearly or just over half of the respondents recognize that a fire on their property is extremely or very likely to result in home or property damage. That's important, right? Because the home area and the area, the home itself and the area immediately surrounding it, um, are those places where it's most important, and that mitigation can take place to help reduce that likelihood. Cool. And that mitigation that I just kind of referred to is really important, because we know that Chief Matheson and I were having a conversation about this before we started, right? Like, resource availability to respond to major wildfire events is always going to face constraints, right? Whether it be there's a bunch of local fires going on, and so the local resources are strapped super thin, or there's a ton of fires going on in Arizona, and so the local resources have sent engines to help out on those fires, right? Like, resource constraints will always exist. And so these three data points about, wildfire, fire department capacity, are really intriguing. It's notable that it seems like the respondents to our survey kind of recognize those resource constraints, right? Only 10% of the respondents agree or strongly agree that local firefighters have the sufficient resources to protect threatened homes. It's probably pretty accurate in a small rural, what I'm imagining is mostly, if not all, volunteer fire department. Only 25% agree or strongly agree that the fire department would save their home if there was a fire on their property. Interesting little tidbit there, right? Like, 10% of folks think that there's sufficient resources, but then an additional 15% think that their home will be saved, right? I won't read too far into that, but it's intriguing. And it seems that respondents recognize the role of, mitigating on their properties for firefighting safety, right? Nearly everybody agrees or strongly agrees that reducing wildfire risk on their property improves firefighter safety. It's really important, right? Because again, like, as we start thinking about these data points not as individual things, but as pieces of a narrative, we start, learning a bit more about the people who we're trying to serve. So that's kind of one piece of the pie, right? Like, perceptions on risk and firefighting capacity. But another really significant piece of this wildfire mitigation and preparation pie is evacuation. Is there anything I need to say here? I think I can probably just move on. So we ask a handful of questions related to folks' preparedness to evacuate. And all these, the following several slides are going to look really similar to these. And so what we found at a high level are that the majority of respondents, 71%, have an evacuation plan for the people in their household. Great. 59% of respondents, so just over a majority, who have pets, have an evacuation plan for those pets. And a slight majority, 54%, agree or strongly agree with the statement, "I will receive an evacuation order with enough time to evacuate." So at a surface level, these are kind of intriguing results to me. Of course, right? Like, emergency managers would love to see everybody claiming to have an evacuation plan for themselves and their pets. And it's really important stuff. I don't mean to be doom and gloom, right? But nightmare scenarios occur every year when folks re-enter their homes to try and save their pets. It happens every single year. And so evacuation planning for your pets is a really important thing to do. You might not be home. You might, anyway, I need not dive into the details, but it is important. And I can't really speak to the timeliness or efficacy of like local emergency notifications here in Routt County. But if you aren't thinking that you'll get a notice in time, it's probably even more important to be prepared ahead of time, right? And so only a slight majority of folks even think that they're going to get a notification in time to evacuate. Again, so even more important to do these things. And so now that we've covered this at like a high level, we'll dig into like the details of what some of the items that like comprise an effective evacuation plan. And so the first column, this one on your left, indicate that they said yes for that action. And then the second column on your right, regardless of how they responded to the first column, indicates that they said yes, they want more information on this thing. And so there is definitely some overlap between the portion of folks who are reporting completed that action and those wanting more information for that action, but that's not always the case. And so, yeah, what we found were that over 70% of folks have opted into an emergency notification and identified how they will be notified about evacuation. And these results are similar to the previous slide, but focused on where to evacuate during an event. And we find that almost 80% of respondents have identified safe evacuation routes, but fewer have identified where they will actually evacuate to or stay long-term. And about half of the respondents want more information on those items. Again, like these are the pieces that actually comprise an evacuation plan, right? So when you say I have an evacuation plan for the people in my household, we as like planners in this world expect that like these are the pieces that comprise that plan that you're reporting. And then this is the last slide that I have on these items. So we asked folks about these other critical steps in evacuation planning. Most respondents have identified what to take and what to leave behind during evacuation, but then there's a real significant drop off, right? Only a third have packed a go bag and a quarter have made a checklist. And these are really important things, right? Like you may have identified in your house at one point in time, yeah, those are the things I need to take. Those are the things I need to leave behind. But 5 years later, when the event happens and you actually need to do that, it's so helpful to have a checklist of like, these are the 70 things or whatever it is that I said I was going to bring with me. And this is where it's saved in my house, right? It takes what could take you hours to just like a short period of time if you just can check them off the list and go item by item. Again, I could make claims about each of these, but that's the one I'll talk about for the sake of time. That's all the evacuation stuff I'll touch on, I think, for the time being. But yeah, interesting stuff. Okay. So now we'll shift gears a little bit and we'll jump into the data that we've collected throughout the project related to like wildfire mitigation on the property and beyond. Okay, this slide, for lack of a better term, I essentially am showing these data points as like myth busting some of the really common narratives that we hear about wildland-urban interface residents, right? So all the time, we hear like the assumptions that folks make about people who live in the wildland-urban interface, or that, well, they don't understand wildfire's like place on the landscape, and they just don't quite get it, or folks kind of just think that like what they do on their properties doesn't matter, it's ineffective, or one that we hear all the time, or that folks who live in the woods for a reason, and they're not going to cut any trees, they're not going to manage their vegetation. What we learned from the respondents is that all of those common narratives are false here in North Routt, right? Like they don't apply to the people who live in these communities, which is great. Again, like from a starting point, high level, if I was working in this place, I'd be thinking, okay, I have a receptive audience of folks who might be able to, or might be willing to accept my mitigation programming. Okay, so we also ask respondents about the mitigation activities that they're doing on their properties. So, the commonly recommended things, right? Like if you get a mitigation specialist out in your house, some of like the really low hanging fruit that you can kind of tick off are some of these items. Um, and these are really encouraging results, I think, at a surface level. Survey respondents are reporting, conducting those commonly recommended actions at relatively high rates, right? Like folks are out there mowing, they're reducing vegetation, excuse me, all of those things. I'll just kind of put a placeholder in your minds. Remember these results. I'll harken back to them in a little bit here. So we also ask about the mitigation activities that folks are doing beyond their own properties. Um, and there's an understandable drop off here, right? Like folks are naturally going to focus on their own properties. But on the flip side, we know that like community level wildfire adaptation cannot possibly be achieved when everybody's operating in silos, right? Like this work requires cooperation. It requires neighborly action, requires community level action. And so, as I interpret this data, I just think that, there may be an opportunity to foster more of that kind of effort going on up here, but nothing too deep to dig into on this piece of data. Okay. With those mitigation activities in mind, we ask folks both about the barriers that are in place that are keeping them from doing mitigation on their and their neighbors' and community properties. And barriers are important, but I think what is even more important is this question. We ask about the incentives that could encourage folks to do more of this work. Right? And so these are all of the kind of like common components of a wildfire mitigation program. Help doing the work, one-on-one site visits, cost share program, a report describing my property's risk. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that these are the things that the Mitigation Council offers, right? So we're hearing from folks. This is what would encourage me to mitigate. There is a local entity that is providing those things. Fair. I don't think that's a response option included in the survey. Maybe somebody wrote it in, but we often don't include written in comments on our results. But anyway, y'all are fortunate because you have an organization that is dedicated and offering the things that we're hearing that people want. This is not often the case. We do projects all over the place with a variety of different kinds of communities. And oftentimes it's like, we're doing the work to try and establish a program, right? To like get the momentum to get a program going. Here it's kind of the opposite. Like a program exists and we're just trying to, I think, make like small tweaks to better serve the people. Anyway, I could go down a rabbit hole about that stuff, but I won't. This is what we heard. I'll shut up on that note. Okay, I prefaced this at the very beginning. So when I started, I was kind of highlighting some of those questions and sections in the household survey, one of which was we asked respondents to rate their own properties, right? Following the same attributes that the trained assessor or professional did when they were conducting the risk assessments. And so we'll look at the comparison of the two here. Real quick overview. There we go. This is like a summary of the risk assessment that was conducted on your properties and the same attributes that if you responded to the survey, that you responded to. So there are 13 standard attributes in our rapid wildfire risk assessment. I don't need to read them all to you, but there are these 4 up here that, give us a general understanding of like, what is the structure made out of? How receptive is it going to be to embers and conductive heat and all of those sorts of things? And then there are these 2 attributes that give us an idea of what's going on in the defensible space, right? The home ignition zone, 100 feet surrounding that house as it relates to vegetation, and then the other combustible stuff that exists. A couple of attributes on the background conditions. So that is more like, okay, I'm evaluating this property, but what do the conditions look like that are going to influence wildfire behavior as it approaches this property? And then just a few attributes related to access. So both evacuation and getting responders in to do some work. And then these percentages that you see are the weight that we assign to each of these attributes, to then assign a point score for each of these attributes that we can then generate this overall risk rating for each individual parcel. So this is how the rapid wildfire risk assessments went down. And then in the household survey, folks respond to each of those attributes, right? They tell us about their own roof, they tell us about their own siding, their own defensible space. But then the last question is just, okay, now please rate your overall parcel. And so what we get out of that is, I'm tapping the wrong place, is this comparison. So the results from the risk assessment conducted by the trained folks is on your left, and the results from the household survey are on your right. What we find is that the respondent pool is generally underestimating risk when compared to the collection of risk assessment that were, conducted by trained or professional folks, by about one category, roughly. So roughly, 70% of the parcels as assessed by a trained person or professional fall into that high category, whereas 64% fall into the moderate category by the self-assessments conducted by those survey responses. And at a high level, this is interesting, right? And it's a really great starting point, because how can you expect folks to be mitigating if they don't properly understand the risk to their parcel, right? Like, that's sort of step number one. But I think even more detailed insights can be gleaned when we look at some of the individual attributes. And I won't go through each individual one because that would be tiresome, but I'll highlight a few that we found. Duplicate side there. So what we're looking at here are just the results of the risk assessment for the one attribute that is siding, right? What we found were that 7% of the homes here in North Routt have combustible siding. That's likely not surprising to anybody, right? Either wood or vinyl siding or log or heavy timber homes. It's likely not surprising, but it kind of raises a yellow flag in my mind, especially when we pair it with some of the other stuff that we learned. So we also, one of the attributes that we look at is combustible attachments, right? These are the decks, the fences, the porches, the balconies, right? The combustible attachments that are on a home that really frequently receive embers or transfer low intensity surface fire in the yard to the structure itself. And what we found were that similarly, 97% of the homes up here have those combustible attachments. Okay, so a lot of combustible siding with a lot of combustible attachments attached to that siding. And then what we learned, I'll explain this one a little bit. So what we're seeing here are the percentage of properties that have neither overgrown vegetation or other combustible items within the first 5 feet of the home. The reason why we focus on the first 5 feet, I'm probably preaching to the choir for many of you, but what the wildfire science has shown in the past decade is that what they call the immediate zone, this first 5 feet surrounding the house, plays the most critical role in structural protection. And so what we found were that under half, 43% of the homes have proper defensible space in this zone. So it's free of overgrown vegetation and it's free of other combustible items. However, survey respondents reported not having these things at significantly higher rates, right? So 85% of survey respondents thought that they have proper defensible space within this first 5 feet. Clearly, right, there's a little bit of a disconnect going on between what the trained assessors or the professionals evaluate as it relates to defensible space, and how the respondents of these properties think about their own defensible space. And I'll zoom out a little bit. This is the same data, but now we're just zoomed out to the second zone of defensible space. So now we're looking at 30 feet from the house. What we find is that only 8% of the properties have proper defensible space, so no overgrown vegetation or no other combustible items in this area, according to those trained folks. And 24% of respondents reported having this much defensible space. And so now I'll harken on your memories, right? So if we harken back a few slides, we remember that, right, survey, like the responses were telling us that folks were conducting the commonly recommended actions that should get you to having defensible space at pretty high rates. Right, folks at really high rates were reducing vegetation, or at relatively high rates were hardening their homes and things of that nature. And this kind of just leads me to believe that I think that the residents up here in North Routt, right, like you all and your neighbors and that sort of thing, likely just need a little bit of direction, right? Like what I've learned, right, if I start pulling all of these pieces that I've been talking about into like a little bit of a narrative, is that we have folks who understand that wildfire is like a part of the ecosystem and that it's going to occur. We also have folks that understand that like mitigation is really important, both for the safety of their own property, but also for the folks who are going to be responding to try and save your homes. We have folks who are willing to do work and are reporting doing work at pretty high rates. It's just not revealing itself so much when like a trained person drives by the home and takes a quick look and thinks, you know, how defensible is this place? And if I combine these two slides that I just talked about with the two that I talked about previously, right? Combustible attachments and combustible siding, we have a ton of combustible attachments with a ton of combustible siding with poor defensible space surrounding, right? Now I have like red flags raised if I'm like a person responsible for like dealing with implementing mitigation work in this place. That's sort of like and this is just like how I interpret the data, right? And there's multiple narratives that one could pull out, but that's what sort of reveals itself to me. Oh, and the last sort of risk assessment attribute that I wanted to touch on before we kind of just open it up for discussion is this very last one that's in the access category. It's address posting, right? Like super low hanging fruit. Proper address signage has like so many benefits, but like really clear benefits for wildfire, right? One, like if there's an evacuation notice, there's going to be sheriffs that are tasked with like getting people out of certain like neighborhoods, and they need to know where they're going. Same with like engines. You're not always going to get an engine from North Routt responding to your neighborhood, right? It could be a Forest Service engine from Washington who's never been to this place before. And they're assigned with structure protection in this neighborhood on this list of addresses, and they can't find your house. It's really difficult for them to do structure protection. And I think these results are super intriguing. So the results from the risk assessment conducted by the trained person or professional is the solid bar, and then the household survey response is the dashed bar. And so far more survey respondents are self-reporting that their sign is not posted or visible than even like the trained assessors did, which is intriguing. But like the bottom line is that there's alignment in the fact that almost none of the properties up here in North Routt have address signage that fully meets the local standards, right? Which are, I think they might have had one or two of them posted when you walked in, right? Those like classic metal reflective, those are like the local standards that people are looking for. I consider like proper address signage sort of like a gateway action into wildfire mitigation, right? Like it's pretty low hanging fruit. It's not expensive. They're not super difficult to install. And usually, if folks are willing to update their address sign for these purposes, we can get them on board to do other stuff. Same with your neighbors, right? Like if a neighbor is willing to like change their address sign, they're way more likely to like maybe clean out their gutters 3 or 4 times a year, or those kinds of things. I just wanted to end on that tidbit because I think it's like really low hanging fruit that can kind of spur some action in the community. But I've been talking at you for a really significant amount of time. So I'd like to shut up for a moment, let y'all digest, see if there's any questions. And if not, no